In the meantime, if you want to say hi in the chat, where you're coming from, how your new year is going, how your weather is, drop us a line in the chat.
Yeah, or if you already have some questions ready for our panelists today. Okay, so I will quickly give us an introduction here. A few weeks ago, we did a different event. A first part of this event where we had a panel on zero-knowledge privacy and regulated financial transactions, where we discussed how ZK proofs and KYC AML can work together. That's zero-knowledge proofs and know your customer and anti-money laundering regulations and how these things can work together. So that panel is available online. We will post a link to that first discussion if you'd like to watch that video. And then we're also recording this, so you can also watch this video again in the future too. So we did that panel and we had a little bit of time for questions and answers, but clearly not enough. We didn't get to all of the questions that our audience had during that panel and after that panel. So we decided to do a second event today where we look at some of those previous questions and also give you all an opportunity to ask us some more questions. So before we get started, I'd just like to introduce all of us here today. I'm Liz Steininger from Least Authority, and our panelists today are Jack Gavigan, Head of Product and Regulatory Relations at Electric Coin Company, Nasim Jenkouk, the lawyer at Annerton, or a lawyer at Annerton, I'm sorry, I should say Annerton, as other lawyers do, I'm sure. And Raymond, software engineer at Government Technology Agency. So thank you all thank you the three of you for joining us today. And yeah, we're excited to jump into these questions. I guess if first, before we jump into those, I'd like to ask if any of our panelists want to say anything shortly before we get into the questions.
Well, let's get into those questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, we're excited. Okay, so I will just start jumping into these first questions here. These came from our last session. So can you elaborate on the ZKP proposition in practice and the light of KYC, so that's know your customer, is zero-knowledge proofs and protocols where the secret stays with the knowledge owner, the famous cave example, or is it more of a proxy where a third party helps to provide a galvanic separation between the knowledge owner and the requester, like card tokenization? So, panelists, what do you think?
Well, I think the galvanic separation that I think they're talking about is where one person attests to some piece of information. Whereas I think with zero knowledge proofs, what you can do is the prover can use the proof to attest to the information without any need to trust a third party. So that's one of the first things to note, is that it like blockchain technology in general, one of its features is it allows you to avoid the need to use a third party to attest to a particular fact. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that third parties aren't involved at all, but it just means that in terms of demonstrating a fact, you don't necessarily need to have a third party involved.
So on this point, I think I'll give my view on from the perspective of a product owner or product company, because when you look at a lot of blockchain projects, you are looking at very early adopters and innovators as the primary crowd of the products, right? These are the people who will go the extra mile, have the technical knowledge of how to operate all of these things, right? But as you have a mature product, let's say something that you want to roll out to an entire nation, right? There are things like digital inclusion that you have to consider. And that could come in many forms, and one of it is custody, right? So it is likely that you can see trusted third party coming up and say that, okay, I provide such custodian services, right? You see that already in, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all, centralized exchange, right? A lot of people who holds, Bitcoin, Ethereum right now aren't really holding it in a hardware wallet, right? But we still say that blockchain is still people hold their own private key, but that is ultimately not the case. You will still see providers, centralized providers, playing this role as well. So unfortunately, I would say zero knowledge proof to really harvest the technology. You really need to own your secret key, right? Because whoever who owns it could really see what you are doing, right? And it's not really zero knowledge if that's the case. But could we prevent that? I don't think so. Yeah.
From it's I think we have to separate two parts again: what the technological requirements are and what the from a technological point of view or privacy point of view, zero knowledge proof wants, and what currently the status of law is. From a legal perspective currently, and I'm not saying that this might change or there might be changes in the law as well, but currently, and this is something we can see in Europe, is that there are institutions and companies who need to identify, that's KYC, to identify a party. And the law states which information you need to, as this company, as this entity, you need to have to comply with legal requirements. And from a legal perspective, this must be really clear. There must be the name, the address, etc. So there is no zero knowledge about this person you are identifying. It's actually the exact opposite. You need to know everything about him. You need a copy of the passport. And you can use a third-party service provider. And this third-party service provider could, for example, be a company providing information in an encrypted way. But in the end, you need, as the entity being obliged to identify, you need all this information and you need to have the right to see all this information. So basically speaking in technological terms, this entity would need the key to the information. And this is exactly the opposite what zero knowledge proof wants and is. So I think there are two different ends of the scala here.
And I think it's very dependent on the context and the use case as well. So for example, with Zcash, the zero knowledge proofs are used to provide the ability to send transactions that are private when you look at the blockchain. So with Bitcoin, you can see the addresses involved and how much is being transferred. With a shielded Zcash address, you can't see that information. All you know is that a transaction took place. So in that sense, it's a little bit like a cash transaction that you can't. There's no card payment record. There's no electronic record of a transfer taking place. If I hand a $20 bill to somebody else, there's no record of that. But that also doesn't necessarily mean that if I walk into a bank and deposit $10,000, even though the cash is inherently a private means of transferring value, the bank can still say, well, who are you? Where did you get this money from? So the context in which the zero knowledge proofs are being used is really important, and it doesn't mean that in every case there's this automatic privacy component. In some cases, the person that you're interacting will refuse to interact with you unless you go through their KYC process to identify yourself. And it just means that the privacy that's provided in that particular use case is very contextual. You're private from people who are looking just at the blockchain, but you're not necessarily private from the regulated entity with whom you're interacting, like a bank or an exchange or whatnot. So it's really important to bear that in mind, that a zero knowledge proof is a very generic term, and it's highly contextual as to the way in which it's used and the circumstances and the system that's built around it.
I totally agree. It's really dependent on the context. I just were referring to the KYC requirements, which are like obligations set out in law. But of course, there are so many contexts you can use which are not particularly defined in the law, whether you need specific information or not. And there are contexts where, and also from a data privacy perspective, there are contexts where it's like really, I need to emphasize that it's really good to have such technical tools. So, and it's, I totally agree.
So it sounds like the answer to this question about the proposition for ZKPs is both and more. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, but we should probably clarify that ZKPs are not the solution to everything either. That it definitely depends on the context and how they're being implemented as to whether or not they're helping in different ways or not at all. All right, should we, any other follow-up points there, or should we move on to our next question? Okay, cool. All right, so the next question is, I could argue a statement to convince without revealing, so I wonder how regulatory and legal views this.
I think we just alluded to one of the aspects of this, which is that in certain regulatory circumstances, there is a requirement to record information. So, for example, banks, cryptocurrency exchanges, they have to identify the customer. Another, hypothetical examples like the proving your age when you're going into a bar or a nightclub. There isn't necessarily a requirement to record the names and the dates of birth of everybody who goes in and out of a bar. So it's very much it's very contextual, but the trick is looking at what the regulation actually requires. If the regulation requires that information is recorded, then it's not enough to simply rely on a zero knowledge proof that someone has been KYC'd by another organization. For example, you have to get the identifying information from them.
Right. So from the technology point of view, right, in most cases of zero knowledge proof, you are talking about SNAPs, or in the full term, you're talking about arguments of knowledge, right? SNAP stands for, succinct non-interactive argument of knowledge. But when we do a zero knowledge proof, it is what the question is. It's an argument for knowledge, right? And in that sense, by itself, it's actually not useful at all, right? Because I can argue to you that I know 20 plus 20 equals to 40, right? But what value has that got to be, right? But in the case of, let's say, a nightclub, where does my age come from? My age actually comes from, a prior commitment by the government on my birth years, right? So where's the source? The source is the government, right? I didn't make up the part that I am born in, say, 1980s or 1800s. I didn't, right? So who came up with that? It is the government, right? So it depends on the infrastructure of the zero knowledge proof, infrastructure that you have, right? If it was the government to start with, and you bring it back to the government, right? Do you think they will accept it, right? That's one part of the argument. The other part of it is that typically, we all know that law can take a while to catch up, right? It is not because law is slow, but in that sense, we want to make sure that we know what is really going on first before we enact a law to support things, right? And in many countries, electronic signatures don't even talk about zero knowledge proof. Electronic signatures, right, are not recognized. And we can still see that in many countries that they are progressing towards acknowledging electronic signature, right? Not the one that you have a digital signing, and we are talking about having a private key sign on the message, that kind of electronic signature. And there are countries that are moving towards it, right? If we look at Singapore, if you look at this act called the Electronic Transaction Act (ETA), it specifically exclude electronic signature for things like title documents right now. And I think lawmakers, if you have heard from the parliament, they are actually working on it to start to recognize some of these electronic signatures, especially for things like title documents too, right? And I think it takes a while, right, for us to say we experiment with things through POC, and then after that say that we enact law to say that we legally recognize it. So from the current point to then, I think it takes a while, but I think it will happen. Yeah.
I just wanted to take the point again with which Jack said before with regard to the context. I was thinking about contexts where companies do get information on a risk-based approach, where they don't really get the information but just a statement of a fact. And I thought about the context, for example, at the credit bureau. You will, as a company, ask for information. Is this person creditworthy? Not all contexts you get the whole information, but you get a score, or you get an yes or no. And this is something where a company from a risk-based approach gets a statement without getting the information. And I was wondering, like, there are a number of contexts which are not regulated directly by law, but where you can use such statements to have a risk analysis, to have a verification for certain facts, which companies can use. I think that we really need to distinguish in which scenarios and which contexts we are referring to zero knowledge proof. And so it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, this is related to another question that we got from the audience before too, which is that identity should be deterministic, certain, shouldn't it? Does the public signal with a person's age info come from a government agency like ICA? So yeah, this is related to identity and in a particular different contexts. So yeah, and I think also credit scores are an element of, I guess it's based on your identity. It's tied to your identity too. So again, the context at different levels. So yeah, what do you all think about identity and the deterministic nature of that in public signaling?
All right. So there's two parts of it. Maybe I'll address the second part of it, because in the first webinar I talked about zero knowledge proof as a black box, where there is public signals, right, and then there is private signal. When we enter a bar, we want to verify a few things. So public signal can be like the current year, which is 2021. Perhaps the legal age is 21 years old, right? And perhaps an identity commitment route that comes from the government, right? That would be the public signal. And then private signal will something be like my actual age and perhaps some secrets that I own that other people don't know too, but yet exist to prove something that it exists in the tree of the public commitment, right? So in this case, I can actually prove that I'm above the age of 21 without revealing my age, right? So then the question asks, right, does then the private public signal with the person age comes from a government agency? Yes, of course, right? But then this depends on the use case, right? What if we are talking about a credit bureau score, right? Does it have to come from the government? No, right? In a lot of credit rating agencies, they are all private entities, right? So anyone can actually be the source of this, what you call commitments, right? Then the question is, do you trust this person as the source or this entity as the source, right? And doesn't mean that it is the government you trust them, right? No. right? So you can have things like government attesting to your identity, to your birth age and immigration status. You can have credit bureau attesting to your credit status. You can have bank attesting to your bank balance to say that I have at least $1 million, so I am an accredited investor. That sort of things, right? So it depends on the context of what you're trying to prove and where does the source of information come from, right? The other point of it, when we talk about identity being deterministic, we want to dissect that part of what exactly is an identity. When you say I am Raymond, right? What is Raymond? Is it this video of Raymond speaking that makes him Raymond? Is it the username and password of Raymond that logs into Zoom that makes him Raymond? Or is it an amalgamation of all the things that makes him it? In the blockchain world, it is very hard to prove this, right? Why? Because if, let's say, Raymond has a public key, has a private key, right? Everyone knows that he's Raymond somehow through a public key infrastructure. But then he leaks it out, right? Someone else who is not Raymond is able to generate proof, is able to sign on documents, withdraw my cryptos, that sort of things. Does it make that person Raymond, right? So as you can see, depending on your idea of what is an identity, right? Is it something that I know? Is it something that I have? Is it something that, you know, it's an amalgamation of all of this? Makes an identity, right? That would then determine whether your identity is deterministic, because someone else could have my username, password, someone else could have my private key. So yeah, the answer is nah, you don't really have deterministic identity. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably Raymond, but his private key might have been stolen. And that's what makes it deterministic. It's probably Raymond, but his key hasn't been listed on the revocation list. So
I think this is a really good example because you never can be certain about, like, it. You can never 100% determine something. It's always a probability. It's like 95% or 98% because there are so many ways to steal an identity. So there is no, I think there is no deterministic way to with regard to the identity of someone.
and I think laws and regulations also, you know, talk about sometimes reasonable efforts or best efforts to, you know, they acknowledge that it's not, that the real world isn't binary, that it's not just black and white. But the other thing I'd say about, you know, particularly with regards to identity and this example where we're talking about getting information or, you know, a government agency being involved, you know, we're talking here, you know, again with this you know, identity and age-based verification. This is a hypothetical example, and in order for this to become you know, widely used, there will need to be a sort of infrastructure and a level of adoption by for example, government agencies. So it's not something that can happen overnight. It's more something that the raw technology is there, in the same way that we've had batteries and electric motors for quite some time, but Tesla only arrived, you know, fairly recently. So the raw technology is there that allows us to do these things. It just takes time for people to figure out, you know, where the use cases are, where there's value to be added, where the efficiencies are worth spending the time and effort to deploy this new technology. And then, you know, we can see sudden and rapid adoption, in the same way that, for example, we saw fairly rapid adoption of, for example, chip and pin technology with payment cards.
So we've got more questions from the previous Q&A session, but we also do have a question in the chat right now. So we'll go ahead and go to that. So I'm on the standards committee and the technical committee for the baseline protocol as the internal privacy lawyer. Would it be possible to speak to the panelists? And oh my gosh, I just read a private chat. I'm so sorry, I read the wrong question. Where is the question here in the chat? Does someone see it? Okay, maybe we don't have a question. All right, I'm so sorry. I started to read a message instead. All right, well, we can go back on topic here. Let's recover here. So we were talking about probabilistic nature too. So we've got another question I'll go to next, which is exactly a probabilistic model depends on data scale and law of large numbers. So it is unreliable. Then why is ZKP trustworthy? So I think this is related to some of what we were just talking about before I did that mess up about how you know, reasonable proof and who is, you know, even proving identity. So I think that that is a nice kind of segue into this question of, you know, the probabilistic nature of ZKPs and why they're trustworthy also.
I think you know, to go back to the example of whether the person presenting themselves as Raymond really is Raymond. You know, there's a small possibility that they've managed to steal his passport or steal his private key. You know, you can imagine that in a world of 7 billion people, there's probably someone who looks so similar to Raymond that he could pass for Raymond purely based on his passport photo. So really then you're talking about what's the probability of that happening, and it's so vanishingly small that people, you know, on a practical day-to-day basis are happy to use a passport photo as proof of identity. So you know, nothing in life is certain. It's not a binary world of ones and zeros. So you know, there are situations in the legal world where there's talk of a preponderance of evidence or beyond reasonable doubt, and I think that those sort of terms probably apply here.
Yes, totally agree. And I think something else to point out is that, you know, in zero knowledge proof setup, in a lot of cases, we need something known as a trusted setup, right? I think in Zcash, there's actually a ceremony for that years ago. And that is also a ceremony for people to determine that the setup is, that someone cannot generate a proof. A fake proof, right? Let's say I'm not above 21, but I can generate a proof that I'm above 21 with fake data. If I have certain secrets to one of the setup phase during the circuit setup. So I think just really want to highlight, you know, Jack's point is that in a lot of cases, we are just proving, you know, beyond, you know, certain doubts that, you know, we can't really cheat on that. And the ceremony happens to also be one of them. So for people who, you know, just looking at technology companies from time to time, we need to be aware that, you know, doesn't mean that it is zero knowledge proof that people cannot cheat it, right? There's still a possibility that the setup phase is cheated, and then, you know, there could be fake proof that could be generated. So the setting up matters as well. Yeah.
For your information, we're actually working on removing that as a vulnerability. There's a new proof system called Halo, which we expect to deploy into Zcash, which will remove that setup phase as a risk.
Very exciting times. Yeah.
Okay, should we use that to maybe segue into some other areas, especially when it comes to perhaps a question about Zcash, or even about a question about how zero knowledge proof and how they work on blockchains. So I will start, we've got two of these questions. I'll start with the first. How would zero knowledge proof for AML requirements work in a decentralized blockchain model? E.g., if a company provides a crypto token that is sold on a decentralized exchange, how would the company meet the KYC requirements in such a scenario? Or would there be no need for KYC as the transactions are not within the control of the company?
So again, it's very contextual here. The KYC requirements are imposed on people or organizations who undertake certain activities. So running an exchange is one of those activities. If you run an exchange where you have customers who sign up and then execute trades through you, then you are obliged to undertake KYC to do prevention of money laundering and so on. However, if I, as an individual, decide to do a transaction with my friend, and he wants to buy, some Bitcoin, and I sell it to him, as long as I'm not doing, and he's not doing that as an ongoing business, then I'm not regulated or required to do those KYC requirements. So the first question is whether there's a requirement. In a truly decentralized exchange, it's possible that there will be no single controlling entity upon whom those obligations will fall. In practice, I think a lot of exchanges that call themselves decentralized are actually relatively centralized, in the sense that there's an entity or a person who controls access to it or who makes money from it. And you can think of making money through trading fees as a means of controlling access to something. If you don't pay me, then you can't access this service. So there's a big question there as to the circumstances in which the regulations apply. And I think it's safe to assume that in most circumstances they are going to apply. With regards then to specifically with, for example, Zcash, we use zero knowledge proofs, again, to provide on-chain privacy. That doesn't affect it doesn't impact upon regulatory obligations to identify your customers. So in the same way that the Bitcoin is pseudonymous, Bitcoin exchanges still need to identify who that customer is. They can't just look at the Bitcoin address and say, well, that's that person's identity. They have to get their KYC info. It's the exact same with Zcash. So the fact that a cryptocurrency uses zero knowledge proofs doesn't necessarily mean that the KYC requirements don't apply.
Perfect summary also from a legal point of view. It would be an easy way out if it was differently. So if you have to comply with KYC requirements, there is no easy way out like this, saying, okay, it's done in a decentralized way, and now there is no KYC obligation anymore. So I can agree with that.
And I think it's possible in the future, but again, this is very hypothetical, forward-looking. It's possible that in the future, AML regulation will change to allow for the use of zero knowledge proofs to prove, for example, that someone is has already been KYC'd by another organization. But that's very hypothetical. We're nowhere near that point yet. Whilst the technology building blocks exist potentially to do something like that, I think that the regulators and the policymakers and the lawmakers will need to get more comfortable with this new and emerging technology before they'd be prepared to do something like that. So for now, the old style of KYC is going to continue.
Yeah, so if I might just add, I think Jack's example of cash transaction is in fact very, very apt for this, because at the end of the day, you can have your privacy that you want on chain, right? But when you walk to the bank where you want to change, let's say certain currency, or you just want to deposit $100,000 to your bank has the requirement to actually ask you where you got this sum of money from, right? Likewise, in the if you have a centralized exchange, and they are required by law to do this checks, right? Then here's the difference between cash transaction and a transaction that is being shielded with something like Zcash, right? With cash transaction, I can say that, oh, I got this sum of money from Liz, right? Because I sold her a boat or whatever, right? And there is almost no way that you can verify deterministically that it came from Liz, right? Perhaps I could submit a fake invoice that says it came from Liz, or but with zero knowledge proof transactions, you can actually show that it actually I can have a viewing key to show like more details regarding the transaction that is not available on chain, right? So I can generate off-chain proof to say that perhaps it came from Liz, and then whether I have supporting documents for that is another thing. But you can actually trace the source. So in that aspect, I don't think AML is going to go away. But it's really like cash transaction, except that it's not. Yeah.
So we've got one other question to cover here. Hi, Jack. Have any exchanges actually implemented the view key solution for Zcash and supporting privacy-only addresses? Oh,
unmute myself. There we go. There's one exchange, I believe it's based in Italy, called The Rock Trading, which allows you to deposit to a shielded address. And whilst I'm not familiar with their technology stack, I assume that they use view keys to be able to detect deposits. The other example is probably Gemini in New York. They recently enabled withdrawals to shielded addresses, and as part of the rollout of that, they built their own custom mechanism for recording the keys that they use to send those transactions, so that they have them available in case regulators want to investigate any specific transactions. So it's I'd say it's early days yet. We're not yet seeing widespread adoption of shielded addresses by exchanges. Part of that is has to do with regulatory uncertainty, but also I think there's some technology bits that are not yet in place. For example, a lot of exchanges use hardware security modules for holding the private keys, and there's not yet widespread support for the type of encryption that Zcash uses with those hardware security modules. But in principle, there's if such technology solutions were in place, there's no reason why exchanges couldn't begin to provide customers with the ability to deposit into shielded addresses and then withdraw also to shielded addresses.
Great. Yeah. So do we have, that was all of our questions from the prior session that we hadn't answered before. Do we have any questions from the audience now, or while you're typing? Are there any other points or questions that our panelists think that we should discuss here? Because we've covered a lot of topics, but there are still plenty, especially around the context and applications of ZKPs. None? Okay.
Yeah, I don't see any questions coming out of the chat yet.
No, not yet on the chat, but I guess I think one thing that I've noticed in this conversation today is that there seems to be a lot of questions around trustworthiness with probability and deterministic points there, and I think that seems relatively straightforward, as we discussed here, that the world doesn't have finite answers. We deal with a lot of uncertainty. We just have come to, I guess, as societies and through legal methods, just accept certain answers as being good enough, and that's it, and come up with standards, and that will, I guess needs to just translate, and many people just maybe take that for granted. So I feel like those questions we've answered pretty good, but there's a lot around context and application. But it does look like we've got a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, please explain the basis of ZKP as if I was a 5-year-old or 46-year-old. Hard to understand. Yeah, before this session, we were catching up a little bit, and we were talking about explaining ZKPs. I guess there's a white paper out there explaining ZKPs to children that Jack had referenced. So maybe we can post that link. But yeah, I think that this is a really great topic. We all need to get better at explaining ZKPs and the different, and that will also help that kind of contextual application conversation too. But so I'm going to let the panelists do their best effort at explaining ZKPs to 5-year-olds or anyone who's unfamiliar with them, regardless of age. So any of you want to start?
I just posted that link in so that people can refer to it. So the explanation that I use is that a zero knowledge proof is a way of proving a statement. For example, I'm over the age of 21. That's a statement. Without having to reveal any more information than is contained in that statement. So in the sense that I prove something, but zero extra knowledge is revealed. So in that example, a normal way of proving one's age would be to show somebody a driving license or a passport, which would reveal your name, possibly your address, your exact date of birth, and so on. So whereas a zero knowledge proof would simply be a way of proving that I'm over the age of 21. Doesn't matter whether I'm 46 or 72 or 21, I'm just over that age. So that's what a zero knowledge proof is. And it's a very kind of broad, generic sounding explanation, but it's a type of technology that has got a wide range of applications. See, Roberto's asking how I prove that me is me with that age, a practical example. So the practical applications of zero knowledge proofs to date are largely built around what I would call sort of closed environments where all of the information is built into the environment. And you, for example, with Zcash, you're able to prove facts about cryptocurrency, about whether a coin has previously been spent, about the amounts that are going in and out of a transaction. So there's that's probably today in the real world those are the real applications that have been put in place. But in conceptual terms, this idea of being able to prove a statement like I'm over a certain age is probably the easiest way to understand it.
Right, I'll take a shot at this too. Zero knowledge proof, I think, it's really about proving the knowledge of something. So it's really how you change that to prove other things, because at the end of the day, it could just be proving that I know the answer 20 plus 20 equals to 40, right? If we start small, really simple, if I want to try to explain it to a kid, right? It would be like, I give him a puzzle book of Find Waldo, right? The game with like a very complex red image, and then Waldo is supposedly hidden in the page somewhere, right? So this 5-year-old kid spent the next 20 minutes on it finding Waldo, but he couldn't find it, right? Now he's starting to suspect that you are cheating, right? That wasn't Waldo there, but you know the answer. You know that Waldo is in there, right? But you don't want to show the 5-year-old kid where exactly is Waldo. It's not. You don't want him to know that it's on the top right-hand corner below the sheet. So what you do is that you ask him to leave the room, right? And then you take a big piece of paper, a really huge one, so that it's not like this shape of this book and then it's at the top left, top right. That's not how it works. So you have a really huge piece of paper that probably 3 times the size of the book, and then you do a little cutout, right? And it's only Waldo and not the characters or the sheep, just right beside Waldo, right? And then you place it over the book, right? And then you ask the little kid to come in and say, there's Waldo. Waldo is image. And now the kid has proof, right? He has proof that you have the knowledge of where is Waldo, and Waldo exists in the book, right? He has proof. You have proven to him that Waldo exists. Now here's the back to the question of beyond reasonable doubt. He could suspect that probably Waldo wasn't on the page. You probably slid a image of Waldo under the canvas, perhaps, right? But let's say that you don't go to that extent of it. That's proving the knowledge of something. Now, how could I use this to design a system that, not just that I know my age, right? What's the real use of, proving to you that I know my age? It's not really useful. So now you change that statement to say that I know my age, and that I know that my age is, before, let's say, a certain date, so that it is above 21 years old this year, right? But that doesn't make any sense, because you could conjure up any number that fulfills that constraint, right? I pull an age above year, let's say 1800, 1800s. That is certainly above 21, but that doesn't mean that it is my birth year. So now then you need to prove one more thing, that the government says that I am above 21, or rather I am born in, let's say, the year 1900s, right? How do I do that? The government needs to have a pre-commitment of that, to say that somehow there's a certain information that Raymond is born in certain age, certain years, right? Say 1800, and it is in a commitment with certain secret that perhaps only Raymond can generate the proof. If not, Liz knows that Raymond is above the age, so Liz generates the proof for Raymond and use it to enter the bar when she isn't 21, right? So perhaps there's also a secret that is only known to Raymond and perhaps not even to the government. So now with the combination of that, I can say that Raymond, I know the secret that that only I can use, so that no one else can prove it. This secret can be mashed together with my birth age, birth year, which is say 1900s. And this two information is committed by the Singapore government. How we attest to that is another story, right? So the Singapore government attested to this thing, and I can match these two information up to that. And the current year, this year is 2021, right? With this four pieces of information, I can actually match together, also like age 21, right? Because that's the legal age to enter the bar. With these 5 pieces of information, I feed it into a circuit that actually validates this and throws you a yes or no at the end. And if the circuit says yes, then yeah, I'm certainly Raymond, and I have everything that is required to prove that. If it's no, then something is off. Yeah.
Great,
So
thanks.
just to follow up, I think Roberto also has a follow-up question. On a practical use of an ID card with no information on it, no photo, no data, just a reply to a challenge to prove if date of birth is less than or equals to something. They know it is me, the one related with the ID with no photo, because I can sign the proof, and if I stolen the card, I will also have the private key. So I think over here, yes, we are going with a more traditional ID card kind of approach, right? But then it also talks about how much information do you truly want to hide or show, right? If I were to show an ID card and let's say I censor out the name and other things, I am still revealing other information such as my age, right? In the case of a zero knowledge range proof, I'm not even revealing my age. I could be a 200-year-old ancient monster and you wouldn't know, right? Yeah, so it's to the degree of how much you want to reveal, right? One thing I like to highlight is that for something to work, for you to have a zero knowledge proof in the ID card example, you actually need the issuer of the ID to be on board this. You can't say that, well, the government issued some ID, I come in as a third party to attest to that and generate something. Yes, you could do that, but the third party is really the one that you are trusting, not the government over here. So we need to be really careful about that. So in short, Roberto, if you are saying that, how do you prove that it is my ID? You can't. Yeah. Because back to the question on identity, right? How do you prove that you are me, right? In the blockchain world, we are usually talking about something that you know, right? And that is usually a private key, right? And if I walk to a bank, how do I prove that I am the bank account owner? Usually I produce an ID card, and then the clerk look at the photo and looks at me. That is certainly not sufficient to prevent my twin brother from withdrawing all my balance, in fact, right? But yet it is the standard practice today.
Yeah, I think that that needs to be tied into like to reflect on standard practices. I think that that's a good point. That again, I think we take for granted the current standard practices are infallible. Like they're not they're perfect because that's why we do them. But it's also good to think about that, fake ID cards are definitely a thing in the world. Does the photo look like you? Have you changed your hair? Things like that can also cause problems with associating that data in our current systems with physical ID cards too. And so, yeah, definitely something to add to the conversation.
I think these are already questions that are raised within the regulatory standards currently. For example, if you do a video identification, you also just show your card, and therefore the supervisory authorities ask you to do a number of other things to make sure that you have certainties that this person showing the card and the person being in front of the camera are the same. You need to for example, move, so it's not a picture that you're showing in front of the camera. It's just a simple example. So I think there must be ways to challenge the information you're getting, but these are things that would need to be shown in practice, and we have already problems like this currently with our ID cards and identification procedures. So, yeah.
Yeah, and
I think this.
Oh, go ahead.
This, is an example of as well of how, zero knowledge proofs are a technique or a technology. First of all, they need to be part of a larger solution to be useful, and secondly, they're not a silver bullet. They are a tool that can help in certain areas by making things more efficient, or preserving privacy or what have you. But they're not a silver bullet, and they have to form part of a larger solution or system.
I think from a German point of view, and I think this is something we discussed earlier in the session, from a German point of view, it would make things much easier from a legal perspective if a government authority was included in the whole setup, to make it from I'm just talking from a German point of view, to make it more trustworthy for the supervisory authorities or for the government at all. So this is just an
right. I'm going to throw a spanner in the machine here, right? So can you trust the government?
I think it really depends on which country you are and what your view on the government is.
Right. And what really is the government, So that's the rabbit hole.
Sure, it depends. Yeah, I think it really depends on who you're asking. I think there are a lot of people in Germany who would agree on that, or the German government as well. And I think also from a data privacy point of view, data protection, like from a data protection, data privacy point of view, there might be a lot of concerns as well. But from a KYC AML point of view, and that might be different people than the others, they might be happy if a government authority was involved.
Great. Well, do we have any other questions from the audience? This is definitely, there's so many great topics that I feel that we've covered so far that could all have their own dedicated sessions about. And when we mention things like rabbit holes and how current systems work in context, and probabilistic versus deterministic nature of how our systems work currently and how they could work with zero knowledge proofs. Privacy versus, so data protection versus data sharing, all these good things. But I'm not seeing any other questions come in from the audience, and we're almost at time. So I will give our panelists an opportunity here. Any final comments about the conversation today, the questions, any final points you'd like to make before we say goodbye?
I think we've kind of covered a lot. I think. I guess really just to reiterate that, you know, the answers to all these questions are highly contextual as to the use case, and also, you know, this technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are, you know, regulatory requirements. And typically, good regulatory requirements are technology agnostic, in that they don't care what technology you're using. They impose a requirement or an obligation on whoever is being regulated. So whether you're using zero knowledge proofs or not, often, certainly at the moment, you know, won't impact your regulatory obligations. But yeah, it's highly contextual. It's highly dependent on the use case, and many of these use cases are themselves hypothetical, in that the technology is there to make these things possible, but it's not yet been implemented or deployed on a widespread scale.
Thanks. Any other comments before we go today?
I think pretty much sum it up. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, and anything else then? Well, I want to say thank you to our audience for attending. Thanks for Tanya, who's on our team, who's been help organizing this. She's behind the scenes here today. And also thanks to our panelists for joining this conversation. I think that it's really great to answer the questions that are out there that are coming around this topic, because it's a big topic. Like, we've covered a lot today, a lot of different questions. And yeah, there's plenty more to be discussing. So I look forward to future talks and discussions from you three on this topic. And it's been great. So thanks, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.